if you're just relying on people's kind of implied knowledge, one, I think it leads projects down a bad path because now everybody's making assumptions. And two, I think it just forces the player to rely on their own assumptions, and now you've created something a little more ambiguous and a little potentially flat.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to episode 62 of the Sandbox.Space weekly podcast here on this beautiful Wednesday, April 23rd in Columbus. I, of course, am your host, Chris, joined as always by Baby Girl, Pumpkin, who's around there, and every week we have a special guest. This week we've got Marcus back. Marcus, thanks for joining me.
For having me.
I've been bugging you for a couple weeks. We've all been busy bees. But I wanted to do something a little different. Normally we pull up things from the industry and we kind of talk about those, but it just seems like we're either talking about layoffs or we're talking about tariffs every week. And it's just kind of getting old.
No fun at all.
Yeah. And
I do without any of those conversations.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously we've got the Switch 2, I believe, is still on schedule for June 5th. But I promised we're not going to talk about any Switch stuff. We talked about that a couple weeks ago. But we're getting towards the end of the semester. And I told my class about this and others. I was like, maybe it'd be cool to just, instead of talking about something that's happening in the industry, let's just pull in a friend and talk about like the process of making games. And just, high level. We only have an hour here, so we're not going to be able to like figure out every step in making a giant video game. But I think there's a lot of high level stuff that when you're sort of new to the industry, you're not always thinking about. And sometimes that even includes like pulling people back and making sure they're not going too fast, too quickly or whatever. So that was my thought for today. And I figured since you've got close to 40 AAA credits under your belt?
Something like that. It depends on what you count, but somewhere in that ballpark.
So I figured you got, not only do you have good job, babes. Not only do you have an experience in the AAA space, but you've also recently started your own indie studio, and you're beginning to, we've talked a little bit over drinks on your team kicking around ideas for what your games are going to be like. So that was kind of my thought. Does that sound all right?
Cool. Sounds awesome to me.
All right, cool. So generally, I think when you're looking at like an academic standpoint, you're kind of looking at game design. One, you tend to break it up into like the pre-production, production, post-production kind of space. I think for the purposes of this conversation, I think pre-production and production is probably more our speed. I think once you start getting into post-production, that's a whole other kind of conversation that obviously we can have at a later date, but... So I just want to get started sort of at the beginning. Your team, obviously, you're working on games right now. You don't have to say anything publicly specifically, but your team is kicking around, in essence, sort of the next step that you guys want to take. So I'm just kind of curious how you go about like those initial process of even before you've selected the title. How do you decide what you want to do next?
Man, I think it comes down to like, so in the case of an indie studio where you're just like, let's just make a game. It's very different than being part of a large studio or in the AAA space where you're given a game or you're given a general idea or a genre to kind of go after. So they're different in the way that you scope those early discussions, but at the same time they're very similar in that the first step that I always like to take is to remove any restrictors, to remove anything that's going to hold back kind of ideation and creativity, and let people just purge every thought in their head, right? So that's either post-it note exercises or Miro boards or anything that will visually or from a text perspective communicate ideas to get them out there to spark discussion. The early stages of a project are always about ideation and discussion. So anything
Mm-hmm.
that gets you to having conversations is where I love to really start. So if you're starting from zero, like literally, like we don't have a narrative, we don't have a genre, just opening it up for wide pitch process. Like here's a thing that I've always thought of, or here's a wild hair idea I had the other day, or anything that is just getting it out there and letting your team or the group or the decision makers start discussing things or riffing on each other. So for me, the very early process is brainstorming, and
Sure.
any way that gets that out there, any process that you develop, the end result is the same, which is conversation.
Yeah. So real fast before we get to that, in your just I'm curious, in your career, did you ever transition into I guess for lack of a better word, like a leadership position in which you were the one determining what the next project would be? Or were you always more in a responsive state of like, hey, we're going to do the next Madden or we're going to do the next whatever?
I mean, both really. So obviously, in my time at EA, it was iterative. I knew what I was doing the next year, but that process was similar in that, like, what are we going to do for next year? Get the ideas out there. The box was just very, very narrow. It had to fit within the context of Madden or NCAA or whatever sports game. So it's a narrower box, but the process was kind of the same. What can we do that's different? Um, so I think that that's very similar. But to answer the other part of the question, yes. So when I was at Volition, uh, between Saints Row 3 and 4, they basically were looking to what was going to be happening after 4 shipped and what was going to be the next step for the studio. I think they were feeling that the IP had kind of run its course and maybe give it a little air, bring it back maybe a couple years later. But I basically got locked in a room for a year and a half as the only art representation of what we called the new IP team, which is exactly what I just described. Every crazy idea you could come up with, pitch it, dive a little deeper, have conversations. Some went into prototypes, some just stayed on paper, um, depending on kind of how the legs of the project felt to everybody, like how much steam it was building. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I was basically in a room for maybe not quite a year and a half, but over a year pitching. I think we took 15 or 16 games to pretty polished pitchable phase,
Oh, wow.
and took them to the studio level to say, hey, here's what we're thinking could be the next franchise for the studio.
Did any of those end up becoming a title?
Sort of. Uh, there was some leadership changes at the publisher level that kind of swooped in and changed the focus of things a little bit. Ultimately, the original pitch for what became Agents of Mayhem came out of that group, but the game that made its way to shelves is kind of unrecognizable from the original pitch. You could have a whole post-mortem and a 2-hour podcast about that insane, crazy, unproductive cycle. But ultimately, yes, a game came out of it, but I wouldn't consider it um, too close to what was actually pitched.
Okay, cool. So you mentioned something. This is something I've talked to my students about paper prototyping, and
Mhm.
I think that we're seeing in the comment here with like Caleb talking about like ideation, and this is sort of a common thing in any creative effort, but definitely video games where it's like you get really excited during the ideation phase, right? Where you're coming up with all cool
Right.
ideas and you're throwing those things out there, and then you have to do the actual work. And then once you get into the grind of making the project, it's like that
Right.
ideation starts to seem better. You're like, I want to go back to that again.
Yeah,
Um,
it's fun. That's the fun part.
yeah,
When you
yeah,
don't have
that,
to make it, it's awesome to talk about it.
yeah. But I think that brings up a very common thing. I've noticed this particularly amongst, we'll say, like more technical, like programmers, this desire to get in engine super fast. And I think people
Yeah,
tend to jump over the power of the paper prototyping phase, where you can really
100%.
make a lot of traction just getting things down on paper. So I was curious about like your thoughts on that. Am I off on that or?
I kind of like to take two approaches, and I mean, it depends on where you're starting from. Like, if you're starting from a genre or a mechanic. I think you can jump into in-game prototyping, gray box prototyping, like cubes and spheres running around level of prototyping in game. If you're starting from an art style, maybe you're just starting from a concept or sketch or reference board stage. If you're starting from narrative, maybe you're starting from text and diving deeper. So I'm just kind of a believer in that, games kind of start from any particular spot, and whatever that spot is, you flesh out and try to get more information and kind of dive a little deeper into that area. So I don't think you're off, but I do think that getting an engine to prove mechanics are fun, to prove your overall game loop is fun, is really critical. Um, I don't think you need final art for that. I don't think you need any visual design behind it. You don't need any narrative. Those things can happen in parallel, which is kind of what we're doing with our game now. Is we've got kind of people focused on the prototype, and then you've got people focused on the narrative and the art, and they're running parallel to each other. But there's no need to mush those together and to complicate those discussions or make final characters to put in a game when we don't even know if the game's fun yet.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that it really depends on where you start. Like, what is the spark that created this game? What's the dream behind it? Um, and then that should be the first thing that you're pushing forward to make sure that the team understands kind of what you're selling, what dream you're selling.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I think. Oh, hold on. Come here, babes.
But
Sorry.
I think the tendency of, like, I've been on projects where you've got either a deadline or a publisher or something that's driving you too fast, too far, too fast, which is we're making art, we're making the design, we're making the tech, and we're trying to crunch it all into the game to make it like this super polished vertical slice that nobody even knows what we're making yet. So those that's what you got to stay away from. But I do think you can work in engine and on paper at the same time. You just need to shrink and kind of isolate what those efforts are.
Yeah, yeah. Obviously, there's a difference too. Like if you're building off of a franchise or an engine in which you already kind of have the core structure, like you
Right.
know, you've already built out that a lot. Um, yeah, I more when I sort of talk to students, you sort of mentioned, you jump in and you're like, oh, we're going to build all these systems and all these mechanics, and then you're 6 months down the road and you're like, this game's not even fun, and now we're
Right.
getting all these like conflicting errors or cascading issues, and
Yeah.
it becomes problem. Like you mentioned, like rushing towards a deadline. I think it's kind of I've seen a switch in the industry. One maybe because E3 is dead, where there isn't like that push. I don't know if you ever had any real rapid pushes to need to get something done for E3, but I've
Oh, yeah,
talked.
E3 was a nightmare to work with. As much as I loved E3 as a fan, I hated E3 as a developer.
Yeah, that seems to be the common thing where like people were just always felt like they had to have something new for E3.
Yep.
And I know a lot of studios, Rockstar, actually maybe a month or so ago, released another statement. They're like, "Hey, we will release stuff when we're ready."
Yeah.
And we've noticed that a lot of companies aren't. I mean, you used to see trailers and stuff 3-4 years before the game would launch, and now, I mean, it's maybe a year out. You might get like a hype trailer or something, and
Right.
then companies are just not doing those sort of like really, which I get, because then there you get your bull shots and your all that kind of stuff, where it just doesn't. I mean, the game 2 years out is not the game, right? Like
No.
how much of that game is even legit, right? So
No. Right.
so you did a couple E3.
Oh yeah. I've done a lot of E3 demos, a lot, and every one of them was sort of a mini production in itself. You're branching the code, you're branching the art, and protecting it from the main line of everything, just so everything's going to be spit and duct tape under the hood, and it's all pseudo fake or mostly fake. Um, and you don't want it infecting. And what that does is now you've got kind of two versions of your game running parallel, whether it's from a code and art perspective, but even people start like disappearing over to strike teams or the E3 team, and it is something I don't miss. I've been involved in like showing our E3 demo to a publisher, 2 days before E3, that it's going to be actually on stage at E3, and they reject it. Now we're starting from zero 2 days before E3,
Yeah.
um, and working, 50 straight hours to get something, and literally running the hard drive up to the person as they're walking up on stage. And the first time it's been like played in its entirety is live
Mm-hmm.
on the broadcast. So it's uh, exciting in a way, fun in some ways, but masochistic way, I guess, at the same
Oh, sure,
time.
sure,
I
sure.
don't know. It's back when I was a lot younger and I enjoyed crunch, and now no way. I would never want to do that ever again.
Yeah, yeah. There's a cool documentary about the making of South Park, because
Oh yeah,
they make all
very
their
much like
episodes
that.
like that week.
Yeah,
And
yeah. That's what E3 feels like.
yeah, there's one section in there where they were talking about like literally they had to like throw the video on a drive and give it to one of their people who had to rush to Comedy Central,
Oh yeah,
and got it there like 5 minutes before airtime or something to get it up. I was like, Jesus,
yeah,
guys.
yeah. Yep, I've been there.
I got a question from the chat here. This is from Tom. Marcus, do you have any preferences on design documenting, Google Docs, Jira, any kind of those type of tools or systems where you're getting your early
I
documenting done?
early documentation, I tend to use, basic Microsoft products. I use Word. Sometimes I'll use OneNote. I like OneNote better, but not a lot of people have easy access to it. Um, I've started to switch over recently to Obsidian.
I've never
I
even heard of that.
like, yeah, it's kind of a Miro OneNote mashup. It's a little less artist friendly, but I'm really starting to see kind of the power of like creating a living document that's kind of built off of multiple kind of canvases that you can easily change and then link them together. It feels a lot like what a wiki could be, just with kind of a Miro-y interface that is more of a canvas base. So I'm starting to become a fan of Obsidian. I'm currently writing my doc in Word just because it's fast, it's quick, it's dirty. Um, I can save it out and send it out really fast, but I will eventually, when I get to the polished version, likely migrate all that information over to Obsidian.
Yeah, I'll tell students or people in the community, like particularly if you're starting out and you're kind of indie and trying to keep things on the cheap, like Google Docs and stuff, like those all work
Yeah,
great. And I like
they're great.
the thing I like about Google Docs too is the ability for having multiple people to come in and like edit and change things really simply.
Yeah.
And you can
I used to
access it from
really
anywhere.
love Miro for those exact reasons. Miro is really powerful. It just they've priced indie studios kind of out of it at this point. So I just don't really want to pay that pretty high price when you get to a team of 4 or 5. Suddenly the cost spikes.
Totally. We are internally here. We're sort of moving from Slack over to Discord, just slowly over
Yeah,
time, because the
yeah, we use
paid
this
the paid
thing.
versions of Slack are just ridiculous.
Yeah, yeah. Everything. When you start tallying up like your monthly charges across just even your software suite as a studio, it gets expensive really quick. So finding things that both work and don't kill your budget is becoming more challenging.
Oh, for sure. I get chest pains every year when the Maya 3D license comes about, and
Oh,
I got to spend another like $2,800 or whatever it is for a license. I'm just
yeah,
like, God.
yep. That's ouchy right there.
Sweet. So we got paper prototyping, but one of the things that this was like years ago. You and I were talking. I can't remember what the title was. Maybe it was Agents of Mayhem. It was something, but we were talking about creating like what I call like vibe reels, where you're creating like like a
Mhm.
video of like what this is not what it's going to look like. And I think you grab
Yeah,
things from like iRobot and stuff, where it
yeah,
was
yeah. Sizzle
yeah,
reel
the
is
sizzle
what I've
reels.
typically called that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm a big fan of those. If you can. if you have the editing skills, if you have kind of the audio skills to kind of to create a track, to create the video, those are really powerful when you're trying to get a team to the right vibe. And that's where I think, you know, when you take it from paper prototype, which is to me typically more mechanics, more gameplay loop stuff, when you start moving into like what's the vibe, that's where I really spend a lot of time in pre-production. I do everything from, you know, like what you're talking about, sizzle reels. I'll build Spotify playlists that kind of hit all the right tones and the mood and kind of carry the right vibe. Now that's it's more of a score, not a sound, or sorry, more of a soundtrack, not a score.
Mm-hmm.
So music that kind of carries the right vibe, but it wouldn't be like reference for in-game music,
Sure.
if that makes sense. So I'll build, you know, all sorts of things. One of the things I love to do, kind of being, you know, a big film person, is I'll build watch lists, you know, and put kind of notes on next to those. So if you're talking about, you know, a particular level of movie, or you know, I'll give you, here's what I want you to pull from this movie, here's the things that are applicable, here's the things that are not applicable to the game, and then get people to kind of take their own notes as they go through a watch list, and hopefully it sparks ideas for either, you know, dialogue or mechanics or art. It can kind of do anything. So building just this big repository of music and video and images and art, and just trying to grab onto the tone, the mood, the vibe, and what's the emotion of the game is probably the most important thing to me. Because I think when you start to craft those tones and moods, you're starting to get into what, you know, your player experience is actually going to be outside of just the game loop itself. So
Yeah.
that's where I spend a shit ton of time, is on that stuff.
Yeah, I think that's super important. I tell my students, you know, you should always be kind of coming back to the way I phrase this, like, what is the core gameplay experience you want your players to be having? Like, what do you want them to be feeling at any given time? And you've got those like sort of macro moments, and then of
Yep.
course, you know, the micro experiences that sit within those. But you need to know, like, I guess you need to know what you're making in a sense. Not the sort
Sure.
of the full details, but you need to know like what experience, what are you trying to say to your players?
Oh yeah. I mean, I've been involved in conversations where we were making one of the games that we were pitching as part of that new IP team, was this kind of post-apocalyptic westerny kind of thing, and somebody said the word cowboy, and it triggered like a week of discussion of, what the fuck do you mean by cowboy? Like, what do you mean, a literal cowboy, or do you mean kind of space western in the sense of like the Mandalorian, or, you know, Star Wars is basically a western. um and I think it's getting past those assumptions. Like when I say cowboy, or I say, you know, anything like, yeah, a king or a knight, like what is our version of that, is what you have to get to. Because if you're just relying on people's kind of implied knowledge, one, I think it leads projects down a bad path, because now everybody's making assumptions, and two, I think it just forces the player to rely on their own assumptions, and now you've created something a little more ambiguous and a little potentially flat.
Yeah,
So the
yeah.
more depth and the more of you can push into it, what's my version of a space cowboy, what's my version of knights and dragons, and that doesn't rely on, you know, Lord of the Rings to tell you what it is what I'm really after.
How do you avoid getting stuck in those kind of loops where one, maybe people have different ideas about what you're even talking about, but I think one of the main issues with pre-production is that it can go on forever. Like if you
Good.
don't,
Yeah.
it's really easy to get lost. We've had these too where, you know, internally we'll talk about something and somebody will say, and that leads to, you know, like you said, a week of conversation where we're
Right.
just trying to even figure out like, what are we even talking about? How do we incorporate this into our design? Do we even want to incorporate this into our design?
Yeah.
How do you avoid getting like stuck in those pitfalls?
I think you have to one, you have to have somebody that is final say. You know, you cannot collectively design a game in every aspect. Somebody, if there's a dispute, somebody has to settle that dispute. Somebody has to say, this is the final call, this is what we mean. But from that decision making, hopefully your team aligns and everybody's like, yeah, that's exactly what we mean by that. But if there's two opposing opinions, somebody has to settle it. And once you kind of settle those kind of conflicts or just clearing the air of, or getting a better understanding of what you're making, that's where the documentation and game pillars really come into play. And I'm a big believer in pillars in that if you have, you know, somewhere between 3 and 5 key statements that talk about
Can you talk
the
about that a little
art.
more in detail about
Sure.
what do you mean by
Yeah, yeah.
pillars?
So pillars to me are if you're talking about the game pillars, I think there's sub pillars and there's discipline pillars and there's all sorts of other things that kind of hold up the game, but ultimately they should be supporting um, the overall game pillars, which to me are simple statements that are narrowing the focus of what you're talking about in art, design, um, and potentially narrative. I don't think engineering comes into play other than making those things. Um, but simple statements that can be crafted that are both evocative to allow people to be like, oh, I get it. I can see the bigger picture of this game, but at the same time also narrow the focus. And then those become the measuring stick of everything you talk about. So if somebody comes up with like, oh, I had this crazy idea last night, what do you think? The pillars are there to either say, yes, they fit or no, they don't. And once you've aligned on the pillars and you've agreed on the pillars, it's a basic way of saying this is what we're making. Everything else is measured against that. Anything that doesn't fit is an immediate, not right now, maybe later, maybe never kind of conversation, because they're kind of a formalized way to say this is the game that we're building.
Okay.
So they're really just well crafted, evocative statements. I kind of compare them to like short elevator pitches, but they talk about, you know, if you're making an open world game, there could be something that says we're making an open world style game. You know, this is kind of the setting, this is kind of the mechanics or the focus of the game, and then something that really kind of triggers the world, the vibe of things. So you're really kind of condensing all your conversation into 3 to 5 well-crafted statements that now become kind of the self-policing, self-enforcing of the game. It's a very easy way for people to then say a kind no to crazy or insane what if ideas. You know, it's like that's a great idea, but it doesn't fit the pillars, right? Not
Mm-hmm.
I don't like this, I don't want to talk about this. It's like no, it doesn't fit the pillars anymore. So it allows you to not only solidify and agree upon and kind of wordsmith what you're making, but it also becomes an easy way to shut down the potential pre-pro bin when people just keep having more and more and more ideas.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I think that in essence is what I mean when I say like, what is that core gameplay experience where you keep referring back to that? Because if you use that as your North Star, I guess, if you want to, then when you come up with an idea, you can look at that idea and be like, does this reinforce
Yeah,
this or not? And another thing I'll
100%.
tell students and people in the community is like, you don't have to put every good idea into your game. Like if you have a good idea but it doesn't fit in this for whatever reason, put it on the shelf. You can always come back to it later.
Yeah. That's what those statements really help with is like, even if something's like, oh, wow, that is awesome, but it's clashing with this, it's an easy way to kind of do what you're saying, kind of put that on the shelf. If we can maybe incorporate it later or see how it fits potentially, but you know, those pillars are kind of an agreement from the core team to say this is what the heart of the game is.
Totally. Which I guess brings us to when do we know it's right to move into full production?
I think that's when you know what you're making. I mean, that's a very easy statement, and that might be a difficult thing to get to, but I think it's a measure of you're moving from discussion, documentation, tech exploration. So one of the things that you kind of I think people skip is before you're moving to production, you've got to be in kind of this research and discovery phase too. So that was always a phase. I forget which studio I worked at that actually used that term research and discovery, but that is kind of the intermittent step between this is what we think we're making, now prove it. That's kind of the more gray box prototyping. Is there new tech that needs to come out of this? Do we need to figure out how to build, this system? How are we working? If you, again, like open world stuff, like how are we streaming, to make sure that we can even load all of this stuff. So this kind of research and discovery phase is more of a tech example of how to get to kind of your vertical slice. So I think production, I mean, if you're drawing a hard line, which not many studios can actually do, if you're drawing a hard line to say, we're moving into production, the things I think you need to have are, your visual style figured out, your budgets technically figured out, like how much can characters use of the mempool, how much can environments use, like so your memory budgeting, and then that research and discovery phase of like, we know we can make this from a technical standpoint. Now let's go make the vertical slice. So
How much in your
that's
just
kind of the mode for me.
okay? How much in just in your personal experience has I guess the corporate budget influenced when you're going to start full production?
Every project I've worked on with a publisher is
All the time.
usually it usually starts with an end date, right? Which is a little, it's helpful in that, like, here's the time frame you have, here's the capacity you have of people, here's the budget you have for the size of your team or contracting people. So it almost always starts from an end goal, like we want to release quarter 3 of 2027, like, and then you're building your timeline backwards from that. So in a way, if they're targeting a window, it kind of condenses that. It kind of pushes you towards an end date, which is, from a creative standpoint, not the most optimal thing in the world. But I also like that there is some budgetary restriction to it, so you're not just going completely insane scope wise.
Sure.
So I think every project typically starts with like, we need a game to release within this window because we don't have other games releasing, especially if it's a bigger publisher that has, 5, 10 games that they're releasing. They're going to try to stack those and make a release window kind of make sense to keep generating revenue every quarter. So you're
Yeah.
typically not just being scheduled against yourself, you're kind of being scheduled against what else is potentially in the publisher's, game portfolio.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I hear that 'cause I think that's also sort of an interesting element where you mentioned research and discovery. I don't think I have ever worked on a creative project in my life where at some part of the way through the project, things didn't coalesce in some interesting way where you're like, wow, that is a really cool
Mhm.
idea. Do we have the time to kind of like,
Right.
maybe there was a glimmer of it in pre-production or in your planning, but then you stumbled across something, some programmer alters some value in some way that changes a mechanic that you're like, holy shit, that's really cool.
Right.
And then
Absolutely.
now you've got a different sort of decision to make. Have you had any like of those sort of moments where you're just, maybe you're 2 years into a 4-year production cycle and you're like, ooh, can we modify, can we massage our design to implement this idea because it just seems so cool or useful or
Yeah,
whatever?
most of my experience with that, it's never really been like, here's a completely different mechanic or gameplay experience. It's usually on the story side is where I've been hit by that, where the
Okay.
story will morph, which now means we need a new mission, which now means we need new art. All of those things kind of trigger out from the narrative,
Those writers,
which
man,
has been
always causing
it's been
trouble.
yeah, it's both good and bad because like there's so many times when I'm like that is so much more compelling. Like that's a better ending. That's a better, middle the kind of part of the arc in the middle of the arc. Like that's a great arc. Can we make it work with what we have, or what is the scope of that change? And I've been hit with both like, oh, that's great. We can just shuffle some assets around and kind of just
Mm-hmm.
kind of reconfigure what we were already doing. And then I've been a part of some that were like, oh my God, that's like four new characters. That's like 8 months of character artist time. And now what else is falling off the table? So I think if you're working within a team that understands scope and change management and risk management, I think putting new things in, making sure that things that at the end of the priority list fall off versus just squeezing it in and condensing timelines and scope is fine, but you really have to have a good understanding of project management to make that stuff work.
Have you ever been on a project where like something's not quite right, but you just have faith you'll figure it out in the process?
Yeah, that never works. When you know something's wrong and you just hope somebody else is going to fix it, or you hope that it comes together,
Yeah,
that's not a great place to be.
we
I
have.
I tend to think like when you know something's wrong, you're not the only one that knows something's wrong, and the rest of the team feels it. And I think that's where you get into that kind of middle of the project slog, especially if you're working on a 3-year cycle. That middle year can either be super exciting because the game's coming together, or exactly what you're talking about. Everyone's going, I don't know yet. And I think if you're in that I don't know yet phase, you better jump back to kind of that pre-pro rediscovery phase and figure it out quick. Because if you're waiting for it to all just everybody check all their shit in right at the end and oh, there's the game,
Yeah.
man, I don't think you're making something very, very deep or cohesive at that point.
Yeah, there's a game I've been an internal game here in Multivarious. We kind of prototyped a little bit, and I'm trying to. There's just this part of it where I don't have it quite figured. It doesn't. It's not
Hmm.
gelling, and unfortunately, it's kind of the ending, which is sort of a big
Yeah,
deal.
that's a big deal.
And so like it's just like every so often. This morning when I was kind of at the gym, I was thinking about it again. I was like, "What the fuck? What is? How do I navigate this?" Now we're not
Right.
actually working on the game because we're busy doing other stuff, so it's not like it can just sit around boiling in my head, I guess,
Sure.
for another decade. But
Right.
I guess that sort of hits to that just the discoverability. As you're creating a project, you're also learning about the project and you're learning about yourself and
Sure.
and whatnot. And sometimes those things, like when I went to art school, there were numerous projects where of course I waited to the last minute, right? And then it'd be like midnight or 1 in the morning,
Yeah.
and I hit on something really sharp, and I was like, oh, okay. But now I could just wrap this up in the next 30 minutes to an hour, or if I open this door, I'm not getting any sleep tonight. It's going to be like 7 in the
Right.
morning before I finish
Yep.
this. And I kind of have to decide if it's
That's
worth
where
it or not.
prioritization is really kind of key, and I think this is kind of one of the missing aspects is like you talk about risk management or project management or change management, like understanding here are the big things that are really important. Even if you don't have them solved, here's the big thing that's really important. Here's some other things that aren't quite as important, and if they go away, yeah, it might hurt, but will it change the entire player experience? Maybe not. So, when you're talking about the project overall, like having a clear understanding from the start is good at a high level, but you're right. As you work your way through the mid and low level details of the game, you might uncover something that you didn't think of, or something that's better, or something that is just like, this is not at all what we thought it was going to be when it came together. But if you have that overall assessment of the project and really sat down and talked about, here's the big beats, here's the core pillars, here's the things that are important to this game, those should be the things you're spending a lot of that discovery time on. And then the things that, if that eats up more of your time, then that's where that kind of change in risk management comes into play. That maybe these smaller decisions, or maybe character skins or an additional weapon or something, just kind of falls off the end of the table and you don't truly need it. And if you
Yeah.
have those types of things, that's really important. So I am just kind of a big fan of kind of trying to schedule out a project in its entirety, not every moment, not hour to hour, but like big buckets of things, versus what the industry has kind of shifted to, which is this agile scrum kind of weird version of both of those things mixed together, where you're only thinking about 2 or 3 months out at a time. And I think what that does is create the inability to see the end, and then the inability to kind of see your overall prioritization. So I think if you can
Yeah.
just go through and tag things early, that gives you the flexibility to uncover new things and build in time to have those aha moments, or wouldn't it have been cool if we did this instead,
Yeah.
kind of discovery things. So
Yeah. That's
I don't
really
know, there's a
interesting.
lot of project management goes into all of this. I mean, we're very visual, we're very experience driven, but understanding what it is you're doing and how you're going to go about planning that is, man, that's so important.
Yeah. That's why it's a little disheartening to hear just from like when I think of things like your large goals or your vision, if you want to use that word, like that should be clearly, in my opinion, should be clearly articulated as early as you can to the entire
Sure.
team. And then, you can use your agile or iterative processes to build those chunks out over time. But that vision, everybody should sort of understand the vision and the heart of the
Yeah.
project, even if you don't understand every step along the way.
Yeah.
I just can't imagine building something like, I mean, maybe that's why a lot of the AAA games are just kind of like lackluster these days.
I'm pretty sure that a lot of games don't spend enough time in pre-production, and they don't spend enough time educating the team on, this is what we're trying to accomplish, or even putting the effort into like understanding kind of the emotion of the game versus just the task.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of it too falls to the team to also invest. I've seen a lot of leadership teams. I've been a part of leadership teams. I've been a part of, more of the production staff, and I've watched a lot of people not invest themselves. So, leadership is always going to take the hit. Like producers, the art director, the creative director is always going to be the one like, oh, they don't know what they're doing. But I've seen a lot of really talented, high level directors put together great vision packages and then watched as the teams don't digest that stuff. So there's a lot of ownership on everybody involved to spend the time watching the movies in a watch list, or listening to the playlist, or going through the reference material and truly understanding it, and then asking questions that help themselves clarify it. And the bigger the team, the harder that investment really is. So the size of teams, like I want to say a lot of teams skip that step, but I also know the sheer volume of a 200-person team, you're going to have many, many pockets of people that aren't truly digesting and understanding and then really buying in on things, and then may be afraid to ask questions, or aren't proactive in their understanding of the game title. So there's a two-way street. There's leadership putting it together, but then there's also the team understanding and digesting that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder, we're kind of getting a little off the topic here, but I just feel, at least in today's world, everyone's just so burnt out. People are exhausted. It's kind of like, I've noticed this with certain business relationships I have, where some people are just like, dude, just tell me what to fucking do. Like, I don't
Right.
like
Sure.
they're not like you said, they're not bought in, and I don't think it's because they don't want to. I think it's just people are just so burnt out, and then you add crunch on top of that. I think there is a underswell. I've seen it a lot. We've had these conversations like at Dice and stuff, where companies are making big profits, people are busting their ass, and then they're getting fired, and they're like, "Why should I give a little bit of that extra of myself if I'm not
Right.
going to receive that in return?"
Yeah.
Which is a whole other conversation we can get into. I think that's maybe a
Yeah,
cultural
I think
issue
it
we're
ties to
having.
buy-in, and I think there's a lot of things that tie into that burnout feel. I think fear is a big thing. Everybody's kind of afraid right now of losing their job, losing their team, losing their studio. So there's a lot of fear, which I think retract people into their own bubble, and maybe they're worried more about themselves, and rightfully so. I'm not taking shots,
Yeah,
but I think we've seen an industry change from let's talk about the game and hopefully this game is cool and makes money to talking about making money before we even talk about the game. So I feel like the business has jumped the creative in so many ways. Now maybe that's my perspective kind of being more of a studio kind of leader, but
no, well, that was going to
I
tie
don't
me.
remember as a developer 20 years ago talking about the ROI. I
Yeah,
don't remember talking stuff. And now we talk about that stuff before we even make a game. We're looking at genre and market holes and analyzing everything to see if this game is even worth pursuing versus earlier in my career where it was about the creative and the excitement behind making a thing that we hope other people feel that excitement. And I think it's tangible. I think you can feel a lot of these mega teams, mega studios that are not
totally.
having investment from their teams, and the games feel, you know, good and pocketed in place and bad in pockets of others, and it's not a cohesive thing. And you can feel the team's investment
Well,
in it.
that
And
well
I
that
think
brings
there's
me
a
to
lot of
the
things that stack up to make that.
you mentioned risk management, because I think that sort of has a double sided meaning, and I can talk about healthcare, but when you think about risk management, are you talking about risks to making the project as
Yes.
successful and creative as it can be, or is like sometimes risk management is like I could argue if you wanted to, if I was a lawyer, I could argue that getting Cyberpunk out on its release date was a risk management thing because they needed to make sure that it was going to hit its ROI metrics, even though that game was
Sure.
obviously not ready for release.
Yeah. Yeah. I think when I talk about risk management, it's basically scope management. Like, is this new idea risky to the timeline, to the project, to the people? Like, are we going to burn everybody out? Are we going to go against our core principles as a studio where we say, we're a no crunch studio, and all of a sudden here's a new feature that breaks that tenant? Um, so for me, risk management is more about the project, but I don't think you're wrong in that there's a different type of risk management, and that's more the studio level or the publisher level, which is they have to assess a production timeline to say, hey, if we don't get out and start generating revenue, half of you don't have jobs anymore. Right. So there's multiple levels of risk management.
Yeah,
And we were talking
my
more about
from
projects. So
healthcare,
that's,
when people say risk management, what they mean is how do we not get sued? Like that's what
no. I mean,
risk
how does the
management is for them.
project not get blown up, or how do you not
Yeah,
kill your people in the process?
yeah.
But yeah, I think, yeah, there's different types. That's more
Which
prioritization. What I'm talking about is more scope management.
yeah. Well, I think it's funny too because the healthcare space. I don't know where it's going to go lately, but it went through sort of a risk management change because it turns out, weirdly enough, that like if you treat your patients like people and you treat them with respect and you talk to them like adults instead of like hiding mistakes and pretending that
Right.
things weren't done, it turns out that like people actually won't sue you if they feel like you're being straight up with them. And it turns out
Sure.
like doing the right thing and being good to your folks is kind of the best risk management you can do from that perspective.
Yep.
So so we're in production here. We're working. We're heading towards a vertical slice. What is like for you? What do you consider to be a successful vertical slice?
I mean, a vertical slice by definition, or by even just the term, is a sliver of your game from top to bottom, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're seeing, whether it's a mission or a quest or a level. I think to me that's a vertical slice from a completed perspective. You're seeing mostly complete art. Whether that, I mean, you can shrink that art down to like a beauty corner and then the rest is gray box, but you understand like this is the fidelity of the art, this is the visual bar we're setting. And then you're seeing completed mechanics, you're seeing completed tech, and then you're seeing things like UI come into play. If there's narrative delivery, how are you delivering the narrative? So I think it's like if you take a 20-hour experience of a game, if you can make 15 solid minutes of that game and say this is like back in the old days when we were young and they used to send you little discs in the mail
Your
with
little demo
from
discs.
EGN.
Uh-huh.
Those little demos, those are great vertical slices, right? Some of the Steam demos, those are vertical slices. I think Steam demos have gotten pretty massive at times to call them a true vertical slice. They're probably too big. But I think it's really just a chunk of gameplay and a chunk of art all pushed together to say, do you get it? This is what the game is. And that's where, publishers sign off on it. That's where marketing should look at it and go, oh, then now we're going to build our marketing strategy around this type of game. So it really is, it's like a slice of cake. Anytime someone says vertical slice, in my head, I visually see like top to
Mm-hmm.
bottom, here's the piece we're making.
Yeah, totally. Well, this is one of the reasons I want to talk to you because I think you've got a very specific lens. Because I sometimes will talk to other people about vertical slices, and if they're from like a marketing angle, their answer will be different than the answer you gave,
Right.
or
Right.
whatever. And so it seems like a successful vertical slice is really just it's a mini experience for the game where it kind of
100%.
hits everything you need to hit. It's you can show it to somebody and they'll get it more or less. Oops, sorry, babes, relax.
I think what a lot of people refer to as a vertical slice is what I would call proof of concept. Like you're proving out like
Mm-hmm.
the game in gray box, you're proving out the art in concept and kind of budget testing against the 3D fidelity of something. So I think there's a very distinct difference between proof of concept and vertical slice. And I think in a lot of ways when people talk about them, the lower end of a vertical slice is people talking about what I would call, a prove it, a vertical or a proof of concept, or they're talking about a releasable demo to the public, which is way past what a vertical slice actually is. So I think that there's a lot of misconception or misterming or different terming. Maybe it's not even wrong, but the way that I think about it is proof of concept, vertical slice, demo. Those are all very different in their scope and in their focus.
Yeah, I've had this conversation with my students many times where it's like, I mean, part of just being in the world we are now is words don't seem to mean things anymore. And yeah, we just sort of interchangeably use like vertical slice, beta, and demo seem to just kind of be thrown around together.
Yep.
And
None of them are the same thing.
yeah, but you talk to, and obviously like a lot of companies they'll start, instead of doing demos or whatever, they do betas, and that's a way for them to be like, we're still in development, don't yell at us if shit falls
Yeah.
apart,
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
And so even I we were talking yesterday with my class, even the term gold I don't think means anything. Like if every game under the sun gets a day one patch, like
It
if
doesn't mean
if
anything.
gold is like I have shit I can stick onto a disc, then
Right.
you did it.
Yeah. And I think it's fine. I mean, every studio I've worked in has different definitions of those things,
Mm-hmm.
but they should have those definitions before you start working on those things. You should have, as a studio, defined what we mean by pre-pro, discovery, uh, production, beta, alpha. Like you should have those definitions. And if you can define what your terminology is, I mean, it doesn't really matter if my view of a proof of concept is different than yours, as long as within the same studio, those are clearly defined and understood. So I think every studio talks about these things, talks about like the full production timeline in different chunks with the different meanings. Where I've seen that go very wrong is when you get a bunch of people coming from different studios or different structures that they've worked in. They come with their own definitions of those, their own terminology. And if the studio that you're now in doesn't redefine that for all those differing opinions or different experiences,
Mm-hmm.
then the team doesn't know what the hell they're doing. And that happens way too often. Is you
Yeah.
get a put together a really good team, but they all have different backgrounds and understandings, and no one ever recalibrates that for that current team.
For sure, for sure. All right, well, we're in our final couple of minutes here, so I guess just we're in production. How do we take this baby home? How do we get it out to release? We've done our vertical slice. We've been deving it for however long we need to. Like, what is our sort of final entry point into pulling the plane in?
Yeah, I think that's where you get into. I mean, you should have been testing the whole time, but like focus testing, play testing, mock reviews, all those things are when you're going to get more feedback on like, here's the game we've made. Did we miss anything major? Are we communicating clearly with the player, whether that's narratively, visually, mechanically? Um, and then you're just fixing either bugs or hopefully you're not going too far back. Hopefully you've been doing a lot of that stuff along the way, but that's when you hit a beta state, that's where you're as a team saying, we think we're really close to being done. Maybe you're 80, 90%. Now let's push that to full completion. So it's very similar to what I would say, like when an artist says to a teacher or a mentor, I finished what I've made, now give me feedback. And then that last 10, 15, 20% is where you're going to have to polish the thing.
Mm-hmm.
So beta to me is where you, as a team, you think you're mostly done. You're entering in with all the assets, you're entering with the full experience. And now you're just making sure that you haven't missed anything major and the damn thing doesn't crash,
Yeah, you got to do
right?
your
So
optimization.
that's really where testing, focus testing, play testing, all that stuff really, really comes into play. And hopefully, you're getting daily reports of things to go fix or, go back and tweak, whether it's player doesn't know where they're lost. And maybe you got to go and put in some kind of marker or a UI kind of aspect to kind of help the player navigate. But it shouldn't be a major overhaul of the game. If you're getting beta and you're going back to the drawing board, you've messed something pretty
Yeah. Well,
bad
I
up through
I want to
production.
ask you a question about that in a second, but this is also, I think, particularly with the larger studios, where you'll begin to see portions of the team get offloaded onto the next
Yeah.
project
Yep.
as those tasks begin to dry up. So
Absolutely.
I guess I'm kind of curious, whatever's not under NDA or whatever, but did you have what's like your worst beta where the team is like, oh shit, like we need to fix it, like we have a big red alarm blaring. Did you ever have one of those?
I mean, I'll just say some of the open world projects I've been on when we've hit beta, discovering like these zones won't even load on a retail kit. Like we've missed something drastic on the streaming side of how assets get loaded or memory management, or this asset in particular is too expensive and now it's populated throughout the entire world. Like that level of, oh shit, we have to go backwards has been something I've experienced too often, where we kind of skip that early pre-pro goal of like nailing down the budgetary limits of in-game memory and streaming and GPU versus CPU, like all that technical stuff that artists typically don't want to talk about. They get nailed by it at the end when you
Mm,
realize, oh my God, we've got to go strip out 10 of these buildings because this world won't load. And now you've got 1,000 empty lots to go put new buildings in that are a lower cost or reused from other areas. So um yeah, I've seen some really bad stuff on the memory side happen in beta. And then I've seen It was part of a version of a sports game where we realized the entire commentary system was pretty terrible, and testers were reacting poorly to it. And these are like external play testers, not internal QA.
Yeah.
Were reacting very negative to it, going, I don't understand why you guys made this change at all. And now suddenly they're going back to the drawing board of re-recording thousands of hours of
Oof.
commentary audio.
Oh, that's rough.
That was brutal. That one was absolutely brutal.
That's
So,
rough. All
but
right.
that's where you're
Well,
not defining it up front, right? And testing it up front is really, really key. Like you just can't go too far too fast without checking yourself.
yeah, I think people have a tendency to overestimate, like when it comes to things like optimization and whatnot. I think they
Mhm.
have a tendency to overestimate how much they can squeeze out of a
Yeah.
system, and it ultimately is always just going to bite you in the ass in the end.
Yeah. I think gating is kind of a lost thing. Like it used to be you'd submit a milestone to a publisher and they would say, yes, go forward, or no, go fix this before you go forward. And now gating to me feels more like a thumbs up. Oh, looks good, guys, go ahead, and not really an external set of eyes that are truly and critically critiquing the game, making sure that you're on the right path. So I think if you can be honest with yourselves or get other people to kind of say, don't go forward until you fix XYZ, that is a good way to really kind of stop some of that snowballing towards the end.
Yeah, I this is part of a longer conversation, but I've been noticing, thinking about, it feels like the whole world right now in every industry is just like bulldozing towards getting things done, quote unquote productivity, um, without a lot of thought on why we're doing any of these things or what
Yep.
the end quality is going to be. I'm seeing it in like virtually every industry, and maybe that ties back into, like you said, we just have stress and fear, and people are just trying to like do whatever. I'm hoping that this might be a good point for just everybody in society to kind of take a gut check on like, what are they doing and do they really find value in it, and what's the meaning in the work that we're doing, instead of
Yeah.
just continually doing stuff. But that seems to just be permeating everywhere these days, where it's just like, just get the
Yeah.
thing done.
I think it's in, there's definitely an impatience to get the thing done. I think that there's an expectation. I mean, if you want to launch me on another hour tangent, I'll talk about like player expectation, which I think influences all these
Hmm.
developer kind of issues.
Yeah.
Player expectation is a huge issue where, players want these bigger things that teams can't truly deliver. So I think player expectation combined with financial burden, combined with impatience, combined with a lot of the production flaws we've seen are really the cause of a lot of the kind of flat experiences or games like Cyberpunk or Days Gone that turned out to be great games, but when they were launched, they were a buggy, not great experience,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, totally. All right. Well, Marcus, thanks so much. I think chat, you can let us know if you want us to have. We can still talk about post production. We can talk about gamer expectations is on the list. So if
Yeah,
anybody in
yeah.
chat wants us to talk about those things, but Marcus, man, I know you're busy, so I want to cut out here. But thanks so much for being on there. Is there any last thoughts you want to give before we wrap up?
No, nothing. Always fun to sit down and chat about games. I mean, pre-production is awesome and fun. Don't skip it. That's
Yeah.
the best part of making games is when there's no rules.
Well,
So I love that part of the process.
I think they always say that it's good to have the heart of a teacher, and Marcus, you have the heart of a teacher, so it's good talking with you about these things and letting.
Cool.
I know some of my students are on the chat and probably watch the VOD on YouTube afterwards. So,
Awesome. Well,
this has been episode 62 of the Sandbox.Space weekly podcast. Thanks so much. Real fast, a reminder for GDEX, thegdex.com. Our volunteer applications are out. So if you want to volunteer, please sign up for that. We also still have some spots for exhibitors and for speaking sessions and experiences. So all those applications are on the website if you want to be involved there. But otherwise, Thank you so much for watching. Marcus, thank you for being on the show. Thank you, everybody in chat. On behalf of Pumpkin, Baby, and myself, we will see you next week.